Hello and welcome back to What's Your History, the podcast that covers all areas of history, heritage and archaeology, no matter how big or how small, how well known or how niche. Today's guest was Martin Baines, who is an ex-police officer and also the creator of the Bradford Police Museum. Talking with Martin was fascinating, for he has a lot of insight into policing history as well as sharing some stories from the museum itself. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy. Thank you, Martin, for coming on to this podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome. And we are a registered charity, of course, so I don't technically own it. But yes, you know, I built the museum with my daughter, who was a historian, and yeah, it's been a fantastic project.
So, what made you want to start this project, wanting to make this museum?
Well, it's interesting because really, I was in the police for 32 years, and I worked from time to time in the police headquarters in Bradford, which in those days had a small museum located in the middle of the building with a small collection from the Bradford City Police, who disappeared in 1974 when they merged with the West Yorkshire Police. Now, because it was a private museum, you could only visit by appointment. So at various times during my career, we'd show people around the whole building, and then we'd actually show them the museum itself. And there were usually groups like school groups, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, that sort of thing. But it wasn't open to the general public, and it was only a very small museum, although it did recreate a Victorian police station inside, so it was quite spectacular, really. Anyhow, due to rank and other things, I didn't have a lot of connection towards the end of my time in the service. But at a certain point, it was decided that the building was going to be demolished, and the collection was going to disappear out of Bradford. And just before I retired, I managed to persuade the council to look after it and take it into safekeeping. And that was that. So I disappeared for 10 years abroad, working abroad, once I'd left the police, but came back in about 10 years ago, at which point I was made an offer I couldn't refuse, really. So basically what happened, we brought some officers from Yemen, and we were told by the police commander at the time, a lady called Alison Rose, that they were going to come back and put a neighbourhood policing team inside City Hall on the site of the old Victorian police station, which was built in 1873. And we sat here now in the gallery of the museum, which was the original parade room. And she asked me if I wanted to get involved, and I did, because I had that connection with the museum.
Yeah.
So we got all the items back from the Industrial Museum and started to build an exhibition here initially. And then eventually, after a couple of years, we got access to the Victorian cells, which are right next door, and the Victorian court upstairs. And then 10 years ago, in 2014, we opened up for the first time.
And why is your museum just primarily focusing on police stuff? Is it because of your background, or is it just because that's what the collection was?
Yeah, well, the thing is that it's always been a police museum. It was a police collection that we had from the old building, and the desire was to build a museum of policing in Bradford, or some kind of exhibition. And interestingly, a former colleague had come up with an idea to do something similar here in the 1990s, but there was no real interest by the council or anybody else for that matter at that time. So it was an idea that had kind of been around a while. And of course, the reason we built this museum was really because we wanted the stories of the people on these walls, these Victorian bobbies, to be preserved and kept and told, and we wanted to present our history. I mean, I was in the police for 30 odd years, and my involvement in policing goes back to 1974. Now, the thing is, there's so much history locally in Bradford during that time. If you think about it, you've got the Yorkshire Ripper,
Yeah.
you've got the Bradford riots, you've got you've got Salman Rushdie's book burning in Bradford, all these things.
Yeah, loads of different things, murders and things happening up and around Yorkshire.
Yeah,
You were saying about the Halifax slasher as well. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. And interestingly, yes, the Halifax slasher is available on Audible. That was a strange incident where there was an incident in Halifax that appeared to be somebody slashed by one of these razor gangs, and then all these other incidents were reported which never took place, and there was a kind of group thing that there was something. It's an interesting story, but but we were very keen here, really, that in 100 years' time, our stories wouldn't be lost. The things that we did in Bradford, that we policed in Bradford, and the social history that goes along with it wouldn't be lost.
You do right. I'm a bit biased because I am a Yorkshire lass, so it's quite nice to be able to see things from my turf, basically. Because if you think about it, whenever you think of policing or any sort of history, most people gravitate to London. And we know anybody who knows about policing, even the very, very basic policing history, like the term Bobby, for example, came from Robert Peel, who was a Prime Minister, think back to Victorian times. So it is lovely that you're talking about Yorkshire's history, not just policing history, but Yorkshire policing system.
Yeah, that's right, Kelly. Because we do collect items here. We do accept items from the whole of West Yorkshire, because I was in West Yorkshire Police, because it was West Yorkshire Police at that time. And the other interesting thing, just touching on what you said, there were some really interesting firsts in Bradford. First use of colour photography by scenes of crime, murder, investigations in the 1930s. First radio communication by a police vehicle was a Bradford incident that took place in the 1930s. First fingerprint evidence to secure a conviction outside London was a Bradford case. Yeah. 3 detectives from Bradford went to Scotland Yard and learnt about fingerprint evidence. One of them with the unlikely name of Oliver Cromwell.
Oh dear.
Well, you couldn't make it up, but it's true. And he became an expert on fingerprint evidence, and he wrote a book. And that was a Bradford case. Not many people know either that the national hangman in the 1880s was a former Bradford bobby, chap called James Berry. James Berry is very famous in that part of history, but he was a Bradford bobby and he lived here.
So you just touched on one of our Bradford bobbies and the kind of path he went down. Can you name maybe about 3 different bobbies that have stuck out to you stories wise?
What, from here?
Yeah, so from the Victorian era onwards, just what stories have stuck with you the most while creating this exhibition in this museum?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, really, because I'll answer the question and then I've got something else to tell you, really. I think certainly Oliver Cromwell's one of them, and Berry's another, really. These are standout individuals, who are well known here, and the people that I worked with, I think, that stood out. There was a very famous detective in Bradford in the city days called Jack Dibb. He's died now, but certainly in the 50s and 60s, he was the detective in Bradford. And there was the last chief constable of Bradford was a chap called Harry Hambler. Now, he came from several generations of police officers. and his father, Granville Ambler, had been killed in the First World War, and he'd been a policeman. And what we tend to find when we look back, at Bradford, and I suppose it's the same everywhere, you find generations of police officers. Joe Wilson was another officer I worked with as a police officer. His father had been a police officer. His grandfather had been a police officer. And as I said a little bit earlier, I found out through building this museum that two of my great-great-grandfathers were police officers. Unbelievable. I had no idea. I did 30 odd years in the police and didn't find out that that two of my great-great-grandfathers were police officers.
You can safely say it's in the blood then.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? And the other strange thing is that my great-grandfather on one side, my great-great-grandfather on one side, was called Eek, and they came from Norfolk. He came with his brother to Sheffield. They joined the police there. My great-grandfather, Richard Eek, he ended up a police officer at Shipley and Menston and Idle in Bradford. He retired in 1900. He died in 1930. But he joined the police 100 years to the month that I did. So he joined in November 1874. I joined in November 1974. My first posting, I was a Bradford lad, but I ended up working at Oakley. And it covered Menston, where he'd been the local bobby. I mean, you can't make it up. His daughter married the son of a Bradford detective sergeant, who worked in this building where we are now. And their children married, and their daughter was my grandmother. And you suddenly think to yourself, what's going on? You suddenly realise that things that happen in your life are not always, abstract. Sometimes they happen for a reason. I don't know, but interesting stuff. So, it's been a wonderful experience learning the museum business, but also exploring the history of the people who worked in this place, and really protecting that so that history won't be lost. Their stories won't be lost, and somebody will remember them.
Yeah, I think it's genuinely lovely having this museum to talk about their stories, and it's also portraying police officers in a different light as well. Because especially in more recent years, there's a lot of negativity floating around police and what they've done. And if you get a chance to come to this museum, it's a lovely little place. It's just in the town hall in Bradford, and it opens on weekends to come and visit. The stories here are so diverse and range from different time periods. Is there anything in this collection that you're currently on display, like that you really liked working on, that you really liked putting on display?
Yeah, a number of things actually, but we've got a World War I and World War II exhibition, and in there's a piece of a German bomber that was shot down over Bradford in 1941. It had been over to bomb Manchester and other places. Anyhow, it didn't succeed and came back this way. And it was shot down by a night fighter. Tragically, it crashed into a cottage in Idle and killed the family there. Really sad, actually. But the pilots bailed out. They were arrested, brought down into the cells down the corridor. And they eventually ended up in a prisoner of war camp. But the interesting thing is that the family who were killed in the crash were relatives of John Baines, John Baines, who was a writer, and he wrote Room at the Top. He wrote this. You might have heard it, you might not, but it's well known. Room at the Top was a film starring Lawrence Harvey. Life at the Top. It was filmed in Bradford. But in the story, Joe Lampton, who's the main character, he came from a small town which was actually Bingley, where Baines lived, and he came to Bradford. But what I was saying is that the backstory of Joe Lampton for his novel was based on that thing. But I think we have remnants of the plane in the collection, and working on that was really fascinating because it's a unique item, really. But the story of how it ended up on display here, is a very tragic and sad one in many ways. But a little piece of history that we've managed to preserve and put on display for people to come and see.
Yeah, that's one of my favourite cases is the First World War.
Yeah, and it's got the trench weapons as well, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And the trench weapons were made by Bradford cops in the trenches when they were in the army. They're all homemade. There's a poker and various other horrible things in there. I mean, it makes you think how they use them, but shocking, really. Yeah.
So it's not common. It's very common to find that sort of stuff.
Oh yeah.
There's another case you've got that's also of interest to me. Is one to do with kind of like CSI sort of stuff. So you've got fingerprinting. You've got identifications of people in there as well. I think that's a very interesting case.
It is an interesting case. The thing about that one, it was given to us by an old detective inspector from Halifax who'd been in the job when I was in the job, and an old scenes of crime officer had used that box in 1948, and so he gave it to the donator, the inspector, and he gave it to the museum. Now the interesting thing is, it's a big wooden box with a webbing strap. It looks like it actually belongs in Shackleton's hut. I don't know about anything else. To lumber that to murder scenes is incredible. When I was in the job, they had a little black box, a little black bag, and in there are the old plaster of Paris items with the little tin mug to heat it up and take foot impressions and that sort of thing. And it's not complete, but we've just presented it as a barn find. Yeah. But it just gives you some idea of how policing's changed over the last 60 or 70 years, really.
Yeah. So you were saying that this building was the old Victorian police station / cells as well, and I know that you do tours.
We do.
Here. Yeah. So are you okay talking about your tours? Like what sort of things you do on that?
Yeah, we can talk about that. Yeah, absolutely fine, yeah. I mean, the thing about this building here, it's Bradford City Hall, but in 1873, when it was built, the whole of the ground floor was either policing or some kind of civic enforcement. And the cells here, there's about 20 odd of them, were built at the time as police cells for the main police headquarters here in this floor where we sat. This was the parade room, and just beyond the wall are the police cells. And they're wonderfully preserved, exactly as they were or would have been in 1873. So what we do when the public visit, we take people on a tour of the cells, we show them the Victorian cells, and they're presented as they might have looked around about 1900. And there's a lot of history down the corridor, villains and things that have happened, and we tell those stories. We tell about the first person or the most famous person, who ever visited these cells, who was Harry Houdini. I won't spoil the story, you'll have to come and visit, but he's probably the most famous person who was ever incarcerated in the cells here. You'll need to visit to find out why. But yeah, so what we do then, we take people up the steps into the dock of the court, and it's a wonderful Victorian court, wonderfully preserved. The only thing that's changed up there since 1873 is the carpet. And once you get to the top, you're in the dock. And in the 19th century, those courts were places of public entertainment. So it would have been absolutely thronged with the public. And if you've never been to court before, that would be quite an intimidating thing, because you go up there, you've got people with wigs on, you've got a judge, you've got everybody, and you are the main event. So we tell people before they go, that's, if you've never been to court, that's what you would expect. If you've been before, or you were an old hand, you wouldn't bat an eye perhaps. But, you know, to the uninitiated, it could be really intimidating. And so we explain the court, and people come back down. And they get a chance then to have a look around this wonderful gallery here with all the history that they can spend as much time as they like having a look at. But I should add, we also do other events. We do a ghost tour. These cells and this building is reputedly haunted. And we do a very popular evening tour of the cells and the court. And unlike some ghost events, we present an historical record of what took place here. We talk about recent activity. We have some images of that. And we talk about a very famous case here, who we believe the perpetrator of this murder still haunts this building. Ooh. So, yeah. You may have your own views on these things, but people find it very popular, and things do happen here. So, yeah, so we do a very popular ghost tour. We also reenact a Victorian trial, a real murder case here in Bradford called Trial by Jury. And we do a walking tour of the city centre. And we do all kinds of different events here. So it's very popular. You know, we've had thousands of people come and visit this museum. And it was described recently as one of Bradford's best loved museums. Well, I hope that's the case, because we like to keep it that way. We like to keep it very friendly. And yeah.
Yeah, have you ever had like Most Haunted come in and poke the ghosts?
They tried. Yeah. We it's interesting, they did contact us. We get a number of organisations who do psychic groups, that sort of thing. They want to come and spend the night here. Most Haunted wanted to come. One of the stars of that programme wanted to come down. And we turned them down, and we did that quite deliberately because, first of all, we had one group in years ago, and it was more like Ghostbusters, and we weren't into that, really. First of all, if they came in overnight, who's going to look after them? We've nobody to look after them. And secondly, we really don't want anybody else coming down here to disturb what we know to be dealing with. We've got a very happy and settled idea of what we're dealing with here, but we'd like to keep it that way. And so there's a little bit of, please don't mess, yeah? You know, because some things are left alone, best left alone. Well, they know us, we know them, and I'm talking about the ghosts here. And so we just like to leave it at that, frankly.
I think that's a wise decision, in all fairness.
Me too. Yeah.
Would you be interested in talking through like a very quick history to do with the policing here in Bradford?
Yeah. Well, going back historically, in the 18th, well, you could go back to the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages here in Bradford, when it was a village, you basically had, what's the best way of describing it, really? You had local worthies, I guess you could call them. There's a name for it, I think, who had their own little armies who used to dispense justice. Towards the 18th century, as Bradford became a little bit more industrialised, well, starting to become industrialised, the pubs in the town became the courts, and there used to be a local lord of the manor who used to dispense justice in the pubs. And then there's some dungeons which still exist in Bradford. There's a place called Sunbridge Wells, and in there, the 18th century dungeons. And there were certain parts of Bradford where people were actually kept prior to deportation to Australia, because that was there were a lot of people deported for crimes. And of course, if you go back into the early 19th century, people could still be hanged for really small crimes, stealing sheep, that sort of thing. You could be hanged. And it wasn't until the mid 19th century that you could only be hanged for capital crimes. But towards the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, you had a situation in Bradford whereby you had parish constables who were appointed by parishes. You also had night watchmen. And as we sat here, there's one on the wall, there's a photograph of one that was taken in the 19th century. People basically who were guards for the mills, they were paid by the mills, so they'd have a cutlass and something like a football rattle, a truncheon perhaps, and a big lamp, and they'd look after the mills in the town at night. And funny enough, in Bradford particularly, there was something called worsted inspectors. I don't know if they had them anywhere else, but these were people who worked in the mills. Their job was to investigate fraud and stealing from the mills. And so in 1848, when the police came together in Bradford, when it became a borough, and it was decided by the worthies and the watch committees here that they needed a proper police force, the night watchmen and the parish constables and the worsted inspectors, who became a sort of CID, they formed mainly the very first police force, proper police force, what you call a Metropolitan Lines police force here in Bradford at that time. And like all police forces across the whole of the UK, it grew from there really. And they became uniformed, they became organised. And in the late 19th century, later on, small police stations were built right across Bradford in former villages and little towns that became part of Bradford as it emerged. I mean, bear in mind that in the 19th century, Bradford started off at the beginning of the century as a small village. The population would be about 25,000. And by the turn of the 20th century, 1900, population was approaching 500,000. And all that was caused by industrialisation, migration to Bradford. My own family, my father's family, came here. Not my grandmother's family, I've talked about them, they were all cops. But my father's family came here on a barge in 1856 from Lancashire. They came from Lancaster, and they came as economic migrants. And that was happening to people all over the country in places like Bradford. The big Irish community came at that time. Now, in policing terms, that meant that there were social issues and policing was more important than ever. But interestingly, whilst there's all this poverty and lawlessness and drunkenness going on in the city, police officers who worked at that time got 1 day off every 2 weeks. And even on the day off, they were still on duty. And they were expected to be on duty 24 hours a day. And they used to go into the pubs and go in the uniforms, It was a little bit of penal servitude, actually. But on the other hand, they had a roof over their heads. They had a paid job, and they had some kind of security, which people outside didn't have. So you could argue that in those days, it wasn't too bad. But if you go through the watch committee meetings in Bradford, there was a lot of drunkenness within the police. Bobbies were getting sacked at every meeting for being drunk on duty or this, that and the other. But an amazing job they did because, they had no radios. They often worked alone. And it must have been a really challenging time. A Victorian policeman's life is really interesting.
It's also very difficult. Like, I understand that you're yelling at police officers because they're drunk. But it's like, if they're not getting any downtime, when are they meant to?
Well,
Yeah.
exactly. Oh, it's difficult, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. It's where does home life and work where does it begin and end? I mean, policing's always been like that, though, Kelly. When I was a cop, I if I wasn't working shifts, I worked long hours. I'd work 16-hour days, and sometimes it was tough on family life. And you know, even then, you were never really, well, you were off duty, but you never forgot who you were.
Yeah.
I mean, I ended up making a number of arrests off duty because things just happened in front of me, and you had to do something. And that used to happen an awful lot, actually, which is interesting. I think it's pretty much the same now. I don't think it's changed much, but I think it is important in your life, as a police officer, to to put a dividing line between, work and home. When I used to come home, um, I left the job at the door, and it's really important. I know a lot of cops didn't, and that's how they dealt with it. But I think policing's always been a difficult job, basically. Don't think that's changed. It's never going to change because if you think about it, you're dealing with everybody's problems.
Mm.
You're the one thing that is there when people really need you in the most difficult times of their lives sometimes. And if you can help people and make a difference, that's worth doing, and that's what this job is all about for me. What was all about for me. It's about making a difference and helping people.
Yeah, and that's what the police are. It's like, if I know that if I ever need them, they're there and I can phone them up or whatever.
Yeah.
But it is also a real shame. I mean, this has always been the case with police officers anyway.
Mm.
But they've always got a lot of hate as well. Like, a lot of people seem to always want to shoot them down in a way.
Yeah.
I think it's getting a lot worse now, as obviously we've got phones and we can just film every little incident people doing, which on one hand is good. It means they're being accountable for the bad things they're doing. But on the flip side, it's like everybody's being cancelled no matter what you're doing, and it's even worse if you're a police officer.
Yeah, I think society has changed, hasn't it? I mean, in the last 30 years. The sort of some of the stuff that they're doing now, we've always dealt with. You always had people who didn't like you. You always had people who wanted to be angry and violent. You always had stuff thrown at you. I think it is harder now because you're on the spotlight that we used to be on. It's got a little bit brighter, and it's got brighter because of social media, 24-hour news, all that kind of thing. And it's not easy. And I think somehow, as a police officer, you have to process all that, And I had, when I was a cop, I had sort of 3 rules. When I retired, I was going to leave physically okay. And I was going to leave with, my centered, if you like. My value system, my belief system would remain strong and intact. And I'd leave the job with that. And I think I did, I guess what I'm saying, I never lost my moral compass. But you've got to know that you've got one, and you've got to be able to deal with that, I think. And and the interesting thing is, I have to tell you, when I joined the police, I was 19. I was very young, very, very young. I joined the police at 19, and I was not confident or self-assured. And the police push you off a cliff. They spin you around, throw you off the cliff, and expect you to land. And I mean, within days, I was dealing with a suicide. You dealt with deaths. I remember I was 19. I went to the house of a lady who was 26 years old. 26 was very old for a 19-year-old, by the way. And people were concerned that she was going to kill herself. She had a small child. And we sat talking to her, and we were basically waiting for the doctor to come, because we called the doctor, come and see. And, you try to make a conversation. And I says, you've got all your life to live, in front of you. She says, what do you know about life? Well, at that point, I didn't reply, because I thought, she has a point. But the point I'm making is that you find out about life pretty quickly. Somebody told us you will see more of life in the next 6 months in this job than people will see in 20 years outside. By God, he was right. By the time I was 22, I was teaching other young people to be cops, and that's how it was. And you grow up very, very quickly. And you leave the job a very confident, self-assured individual, very unlike where you started from. And that's a good benefit, I think. But you've also got to keep your moral compass and everything else, in check.
Is there any cases or any stories you feel that you could comfortably talk about? Because you talk to us about them all the time.
I do.
So you've travelled to various different countries. You've purposely done an exhibition about equality to do with the police officers and people, not only in Bradford but in other places like Pakistan and things like that. Is there any cases like that you are allowed to talk about?
Yeah, I can talk about a lot of stuff, really. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, because at a certain point we had, in this country, we had really serious disorder. If you go back to Scarman and the riots in Toxteth, going back a long time. Shortly after that, in Bradford here, certainly, they wanted 2 people to, and I was a constable at the time, 2 people to work closely with the minority communities in the city of Bradford. Well, it was interesting. It was an area that I'd actually grown up as a child. And it was strange because a colleague of mine applied to do it. He volunteered to do it. And he was persuading me to do it. And the reason I actually did apply to do it was because it occurred to me at the time that the police knew nothing about the communities that lived in this city. Nothing. We didn't know anything about these communities, and they knew very little about us as an organisation, about the police. And so I started to work in the city of Bradford with minority communities, which was a role really that I continue for the next 30, 40 years. It changed my career, actually, changed my life in some ways, because not only did I make a success of that role, I also did it as a sergeant in Bradford. I had 22 officers working for me across a quarter of the city in Toller Lane Division, who were the forerunner of what is now called neighbourhood policing. Me and a colleague, we managed that team. We did community race relations training with them in the community. I became very well known, and we did all kinds of initiatives. Later on, in the 90s, after there'd been problems in Bradford, and I'd left for a little while, I went to work in Keighley. There was some disorder in Manningham in 1995, and they wanted somebody to cover the whole district, inspector level, to work with communities as community and race relations inspector. And I was contacted and asked if I was going to apply for it. I was headhunted for the job, basically. And because it was like destiny, really. It was a job that I could do. And somebody told me, they said, I've just told the chief, you're the only person in the force that can do it. Okay. So I did that job for 10 years, and we did all kinds of stuff. We opened up Pakistan. We went out there with people from Bradford, and we created a partnership with the police in Pakistan and Kashmir. 10 years. We got funding from the Foreign Office, the Home Office, to support victims of forced marriages, and we got the police out there to cooperate on these things, which was previously unknown. We also went out there and got murderers back to this country because there's no extradition treaty. We had a young boy kidnapped, we got him returned. We set up a minorities police liaison committee across the city, involving all communities, so that we didn't get any intercommunal problems, and if we did, we dealt with it collectively. We did a series of radio programs on Sunrise Radio, and we opened up the phone lines and allowed people to ring in, ask us questions, very transparent. And we talked about the things we do, you know, how the police deal with things, because it was very apparent, really, that people in the community didn't understand how the police worked, because we operate very differently from the way people operate in Pakistan and India. And we also went to India. We did a big international policing conference in India in 2002, worked in the Punjab with the Punjab police there. And we got officers here. And during that 10-year period, we got police officers from all over Europe coming to Bradford to see, you know, how the police worked alongside minority communities. We had the police from Oslo, capital city of Norway. Interestingly, same population as Bradford. Interestingly, their communities were the same size as ours. And European countries all over, Eastern Europe, you know. And it was a very interesting time, really. And we developed all the community tension monitoring, community engagement, community impact assessment that is now normal in policing across the whole country. We helped the Foreign Office to set up the forced marriage unit there. And we did all sorts, really, and an amazing time, frankly. And we've got an exhibition about it in the museum, because I felt that that was a story that needed to be told and would have been lost if we'd have not done it. So it was a little bit tricky because I was not only chronicler but participant, but we managed to balance that, I think. And yeah, it's important that people in Bradford also, I feel, have a museum that they can relate to.
Yeah.
And that people could come in and say, well, actually, that's my story too. It's not just about the police. That's our story too. You know, that belongs to us. And that's important.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, that's what a museum should be about.
Of course, it should. Yeah.
Shouldn't just be about wonderful things, because I'm all for the lovely shinies and
Oh,
stuff.
yeah.
But at the end of the day, we should have some form of connection to it, even if it's in a small way.
Yeah.
So I think you've done a really good job in that regard.
Yeah. And the other thing is, you know, we should be prepared to talk about things that didn't go so well. You know, there are issues. Ultimately, what I'd really like for this museum, I don't know how at the moment we create that, but I have an ambition to create a safe space for learning and education and talking about things that matter and how that relates to our past and how that informs our future. And that we can do here, I think. We might need a bit more room, but if we can do that, I think that is an aspiration I think we should try and do.
Sounds like a good plan, and I hope that happens at some point in the future for you.
Yeah.
So the museum itself it's a lovely little thing, and it's been used for, it's not just the history of this place, because there is a lot of lovely history from the original prison cells down to the items that you'll see on display, but this has also appeared in many popular media things as well.
It has, yes, yeah.
One noticeable, most popular thing that people might recognise it from is Peaky Blinders. What was your experience with that?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people think that the whole of Peaky Blinders is filmed in the Black Country Museum, which a great deal is, don't get me wrong. You know, the Black Country Museum is a fabulous location, and it's in, you know, it's down in the right place. But actually, they filmed all over the country, did the film crew. An awful lot in Yorkshire. They filmed heavily in Bradford over all the series. They filmed in City Hall. The last series of Peaky Blinders was supposedly Shelby's office in the Houses of Parliament. There's a room here in City Hall. But they also filmed in our Victorian cells. During one of the episodes, one of the brothers, Arthur, and the other brother, John, were put in cells about to be executed. which didn't happen as it turns out. But that was filmed down the corridor in two of our cells. John Malkovich appeared in our cells down the corridor when he filmed a BBC Agatha Christie Christmas show, The ABC Murders, and they turned the cells down here into a cell for the programme. Keira Knightley appeared at our charge desk in a film, I think it's called Official Secret, where she plays a Gulf War whistleblower who ends up in a bit of trouble. And at the very end of the film, she appears in court and is acquitted, and she's released. But prior to going up to the court, she appears down the corridor in our cells here. And the court is heavily used for filming. Emmerdale film all their trials there. We had Paddy and some of the actors down the cells. And they've even had Bollywood down there, believe it or not. Very recently, a Bollywood film was made, and they not only filmed outside, but they did some filming down the cell corridor. I've not seen that. I don't know what's happened with that. But so it does get filmed, used an awful lot for films. It's an excellent location, I think. But it's interesting, and it just adds a little bit of something different to this museum, I think. And we're hoping to do an exhibition, as you know, Kaylee.
One more question before I sign this off and see if you want to talk about anything else.
Okay.
One of my things I was thinking about when you were talking about the Victorian side of it is when it came to big cases, and people from say Haworth and them lot, would they have come here or would they have gone to the York Castle prison?
Oh, okay, yeah, that's interesting because I get asked that question quite often. Where were the murder trials and where were people executed, that sort of thing. Well, the way it was set up here, the court upstairs from 1873 was the custody court for Bradford. So if you were locked up overnight, you'd appear there next day. 4 times a year, though, it was the court sessions in the old days, which is, we call it a Crown Court trial now with judges and wigs and all that stuff. And this court here would hear all local criminal trials up to relatively serious cases, but it was not an assize court. So this is what would happen. If somebody committed a murder in Bradford, and during the time this building's been built, hundreds of Bradford murderers have been incarcerated in here. They go up the dock steps up into the court. They appear before the court, and they go down the steps, never to return, because they're taken to Leeds. They go to Armley Prison, and then the trial is heard in Leeds. Now, prisoners were executed in the back end of the 19th century onwards at Armley Prison. But Armley Prison's not that old, actually. The last public execution, I think, was late mid 19th century, about 1880. But they also executed people at York Castle. And so James Berry, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, he's one of our ex-cops who was the official hangman. We have a piece of rope in the collection that he used to hang the murderer. A police officer was murdered, P.C. Ostick, by a poacher, and he was hanged in York Castle Museum. So executions were taking place in York Castle and at Armley. And we have a bit of Berry's rope from that execution. Because Berry used to sell pieces of rope in the pubs afterwards. I mean, it's horrible. I'm not a great lover of capital punishment, Kaylee, actually.
I'm not one for the capital punishment either. I don't really agree with it. I know there's some places in the world that still do that. And there's a lot of, if you ask the general public, there's a mixture of different opinions.
There is, yeah, there is.
Because I think in a lot of people's minds, they seem to think that, and I do get it, like if, say, like a child's been killed or something, then yeah, you want justice for that. You want the person who's done that to suffer. But I think there's a book out there by a person who was a hangman who basically stated that it didn't matter having the death penalty because people would just still do what they do.
Well, James Berry wrote a book, Kelly, and he wrote a book saying that he didn't think anything came out of hanging.
It was probably his book then.
Yeah, well, he was very much against it. He hanged at least 3 people he believed to be innocent. And I think the reason I'm against the death penalty, for a number of reasons, really. First of all, going back to the previous century when it was in force in this country, there were a lot of people who shouldn't have been hanged. I'm thinking of people like Derek Bentley.
Yeah.
That was shocking, actually. Ruth Ellis probably won't get hanged now. And there were mistakes, people who didn't commit the crime. That young man who was hanged for Christie's murder at Rithington Place. Horrible miscarriages of justice. You can't bring back your mistakes. We have a tape recording here. 2 men who were arrested for stabbing one of the man's wife to death, him and his uncle. And they were putting themselves down here, and they were tape recorded covertly. And that went to the Court of Appeal. It made legal history. It was the first time that a tape recording had been admissible in a court of law in this country in 1964. And that was here. It occurred in this building where we're not far from where we sat now. They were lucky. They got life imprisonment, but the death penalty was still on the statute book. People were hanged after them. But for some reason, for certain types of murder, it didn't apply. You would think in a domestic violence murder like that, they'd have hanged, but they didn't. But the point, you're quite right. I think the human condition is too frail to make those kind of judgments of person's life or death. And, it's simply retribution. You say that, I say that, and then you think about the Moors murders. Every time I go past that moor on the way to Manchester, I think about that poor lad who's still out there. And you think about what happened. And if somebody murdered my child, how would I feel? Mm. You don't know how you'd feel. Maybe, the values that you have and you'd tip them upside down, maybe. We don't know. We don't know, but generally, I think capital punishment is not the way to go. Don't think it's a good thing. And if it's not about retribution, what is it about? It didn't deter murders when it was in force. People still got murdered. Yeah, very difficult subject, and it's not an easy thing to come to any kind of position with. But I think on the balance, I'm against it, frankly. I don't agree with it.
No, I'm the same. Well, thank you for this. It's been very, very interesting. And as I have already said, I could probably talk to you for hours about anything and everything to do with this museum and the history of policing and various other things as well. Is there anything else you would like our listeners to know about your museum or anything before we sign
come
off?
And visit us. Yeah, we're not hard to find. We're in the centre of Bradford, in City Hall. Come at the front of the building on a Friday or Saturday between 10 and 4, and you will see us there. You can book online via our website, but I would suggest if you do come on a Friday or Saturday, come early. And we're open from 10 o'clock onwards throughout the year, apart from December and January and February. And we'd love to see you. We're very friendly. You'd certainly enjoy it, and you'd find out quite a lot about the history of policing. And we'd love to see you.
And with that, I will thank you again for coming onto this podcast and telling me your stories. And yeah, check out the Bradford Police Museum. It's a wonderful collection. But yeah, thank you, Martin, for
you're
coming
welcome.
on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.